All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. So first off, I want to say thanks for joining today and welcome to our webinar on how VMware VSAN can reduce costs and simplify your VM storage. So my name is Andy Sturwich here with Altero Software, and I'm joined by Teresa Miller. Hi, Teresa.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good. How's it going?
Great.
Hey, thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it. We have a lot of exciting
Cool.
stuff to cover.
Yes, we do. VSAN is definitely it's one of my favorite subjects to talk about at least. It's the whole hyper-converged idea is really interesting to talk about, and definitely looking forward to it. So what I'll do is I'll actually start by covering our agenda today. So we're going to first do some introductions of myself and Teresa and Altero, the sponsor, and then what we're going to do is we're really going to set the stage for our talk. Mainly where has storage been and where are we going. Whenever I talk about some new emerging technology, I always like to frame it from the perspective of where we've been, what are the pain points with that type of solution, and what is the new stuff, how does it address those pain points. After that, we're going to get into what vSAN really is. First going to talk about it from a cost reduction perspective and from a complexity reduction perspective as well. And then we're going to hand it over to Teresa to talk about the architectural benefits, the tool set, the use cases, the real meat and potatoes of our talk today. And then she's going to also talk about getting started with vSAN. How can you get started with it in your own environment? How can you learn about it? And then we'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts and some Q&A type stuff. So real quick thing about the Q&A. Feel free to ask your questions using the question form. That's part of the platform throughout the webinar, but what we'll probably do is we will hold those questions until our Q&A section at the end, and then we'll cover all of them at that point. Now, if you ask a question that doesn't get answered, we always follow up these webinars with a blog post out on altero.com/VMware, and we'll cover all the questions that we didn't get answered, and we'll also have a recording of today's webinar there as well. So if you have to leave halfway through for some reason, you can always come back and catch the recording afterwards. So let's start with some introductions. Again, my name is Andy Sturwich. I'm a technical evangelist for Altero Software, and I'm also a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center Management MVP. Prior to my time with Altero, I spent 13 years working all over the tech industry, from SMBs to enterprises to managed services providers. I've kind of been all over the place during my my tenure in the IT industry. During my time there, my focus has been in virtualization, cloud services, the Microsoft server stack, and it says an emphasis on Hyper-V, but I've also spent a considerable amount of time in the VMware world. I worked for an MSP for a number of years, and my primary job at that MSP was maintaining that MSP's cloud practice, which was based on VMware technology. So very familiar with the VMware space as well. If you like to read blogs, we've got some great blogs out on the Altero website, altero.com/Hyper-V and /VMware respectively for each platforms. And if you're a Twitter user, my Twitter handle is @asturwich. I'm sorry, you'll have to spell the last name. I really should simplify that one of these days. But feel free to reach out to me on Twitter if you have any questions or you just want to talk about technology. I'm very active on Twitter, and will definitely respond if you reach out to me there. So what I'll do now is I'll hand it over to Teresa to introduce herself. Go ahead, Teresa.
So thank you. I am Teresa Miller, and in the community here I have my vExpert, my Citrix CTP, and in the last couple of years I finished up my master's degree in IT management. I've also been in the industry for a long time. It's been 20 years, and I recently, I'd say in the past couple of years, I started a company called 24/7 IT Connection, where you can find a lot of really great information. We have a website. It's 24/7itconnection.com, but also tied to some consulting as well. I love virtualization. As you can see, have a lot of exposure and experience in the VMware and Citrix space in both areas. And as for community, if you have any questions after the webinar, I am also very active on Twitter. You can find me there on 24/7 IT Connect if you'd like to connect later.
All right, thanks, Teresa. So a real quick word about Altera Software, the sponsor of this webinar, and the company I work for. We're a fast-growing developer of fantastic backup software for VMware and Hyper-V platforms. And our flagship product is the Altera VM Backup. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that product or you have a backup need, you can go to altera.com/vm-backup to learn more. So with that in mind, we'll go ahead and we'll get started with the topic of today's webinar. So really, like I said earlier in the introduction, I always like to set the stage when I'm talking about some sort of new technology, some emerging technology that's coming out in the marketplace. And I always like to start with, where have we been? So when we're talking about IT storage systems, where have we been? Where have we come from, and what are the pain points? So we really started in virtualization with the single host, right? I mean, we've had clusters for a long time, but it all started a long time ago with a single host. So we had a single host, we had local storage within that host, and then we used the physical network connected to that host to basically hand those workloads off to the rest of the network, right? And that works fairly well, but there's a number of different issues with that approach, and not the least of being the host is a single point of failure in that situation, right? As is the storage within that host. And we wanted to do a number of different fancy things once virtualization really started to take off. We wanted to do things like high availability and vMotion and a lot of that fancy stuff. And to do that, the single host model just wasn't going to cut it. So what we needed to do was add a second host to the mix. And at that point, we needed storage that both hosts could see. So we added this centralized storage concept, and that centralized storage, it could be a SAN, it could be a NAS, it could be served up across this fabric here that I've got labeled as I/O traffic. It could be served up as iSCSI across an Ethernet connection. It could be served up via fiber across the fiber connection. There may be switches in the side of that fabric depending on how many nodes are involved, and it could get quite complex. But the point is after we added the centralized storage element, we could do all kinds of cool things like vMotion and ensure high availability of the workloads that are contained on the hosts, and it really solved a lot of problems for us. And then just like the single host model, we've had the ability to serve up those workloads to the physical network and pass cluster traffic and all that fancy vMotion and HA stuff across the physical network, and life was good, right? Well, if you fast forward to today, IT budgets are getting slashed, people are being asked to do more with less, and one of the big problems that's starting to emerge with this model is there's a large cost associated with that storage element and the storage fabric as well. I know during my time working in the field, I remember sitting in meetings with storage vendors and having sticker shock and falling out of my chair on, what the cost of some of these storage solutions was going to be, and not to mention the storage fabric as well, because you need to buy switches, you need to buy interconnects, and the cost just adds up for that storage portion of it. So, and there's another thing that I like to talk about when I'm talking about costs associated with storage. There's a hidden cost here that a lot of people and places don't really talk about. And that's the labor cost. A lot of people don't think about that. How much time does it take me as an administrator or a team of administrators to manage a large solution like this? So we've got a guy that's usually, has historically been called the storage admin. His job or her job is to log into that SAN and make sure it's happy, make sure everything is hunky-dory, and maybe they provision off some LUNs for a project over here, or they expand this LUN over here. I mean, that's a pretty time-intensive job at times. Not to mention we've got people that are maintaining that storage fabric. Now, in some smaller businesses, that could be the same storage person, but in larger organizations, it could be a whole team of people, like I said. So again, we're doing all this work to maintain that storage and that storage fabric. Not to mention all along we've had our virtualization administrators managing our hosts, provisioning our compute workloads, spinning up virtual machines, getting them out to the network, and all kinds of things related to virtual machines. And then, of course, you can't forget about the networking team because nothing works if it can't talk to anything, right? So you've got these networking guys that are supporting the network piece of it. I mean, it's this fairly large group of people used to maintain this whole solution, right? So there's a lot of hidden costs there associated with labor. Now, what if we could, simplify that a little bit? I'm certainly not advocating for getting rid of anyone's jobs, but historically, we've started to see a shift here in the marketplace where the virtualization administrators are more and more becoming storage administrators as well. So they're having to not only manage the compute side of things, but also the storage side of things. So it makes sense to try and simplify the solution as much as possible to create a single control point for compute and storage. And that's kind of where the story of hyperconvergence comes in. So real quick before we get into hyperconvergence and vSAN, with that in mind, what are the main things that SMBs and SMEs look for in a virtualization solution? And then what we'll get into here in a second is how does hyperconvergence and vSAN, how does it address that? So when it comes to an SMB and an SME, one of the main things that they're looking for these days is high availability. I mean, even small businesses, they can't afford to be down anymore. Availability is becoming much, much more popular. The cost has come down considerably. And, if I was going to say, if I'm a small business, it's just an expectation I have now that I will be down very, very little throughout the fiscal year. Another thing is vMotion. Customers are just starting to expect vMotion. They don't want to, have to take that downtime associated with doing host maintenance. So vMotion is a must for most businesses today. And they really want cost-effective storage. Nobody wants to pay for these huge, massive, centralized SANs and NASs anymore because they're expensive. They take a long time to install and put in. It takes a long time to manage the fabric. They just want cost-effective storage. So how does that translate into needs? So we've got need one. We need one or more hosts, right? To facilitate high availability, we at least have to have two hosts. That's, no shocker there. Storage has to be visible to all nodes. We all know that, right? So we need a solution where the storage is visible to all nodes. And again, storage that won't break the bank. So how does hyperconvergence in vSAN help this? So you're going to see here this diagram looks very, very similar to the one I showed just a few minutes ago with one key difference. There's no major centralized storage aspect in here. You can see that it's been removed. And we've got local disks in each host and I/O traffic going between those nodes. So really, what hyperconvergence does, it's just the idea that compute and storage is contained within the same box. You're utilizing in-chassis disks inside of your servers, and then there's east-west storage traffic between nodes in the cluster to ensure that there's multiple copies of blocks across every node in the cluster to ensure that if you have a node failure or a storage failure in one of the nodes, that you've got that data someplace else and everything's happy. So, and what the industry is starting to see as a baseline recommendation for that east-west traffic in between the nodes is some sort of a 10 gig interlink. Usually it's 10 gig Ethernet. And when I'm talking to people about 10 gig Ethernet, they just assume that, whoa, it's going to be way too expensive for my needs. And the fact is the cost is really starting to come down for 10 gig. I've been really surprised at how cheap 10 gig is getting lately. So it's really becoming less and less of a concern. So, and one thing that VMware announced with 6.5 last week is vSAN is now going to allow the ability to do 2-node vSAN clusters. So you could theoretically get by without needing any supporting fabric between those nodes. You could get by without switches. You could just do a direct connect between the nodes and even save on costs if you can get by with 2 nodes, which a lot of SMBs and some of the smaller SMEs can, which will reduce your cost even further. So I keep mentioning cost and complexity. So let's talk about that cost and complexity aspect a little bit more before we dive into more of the technical stuff here shortly. So what is VSAN? I kind of talked about it a little bit already, but mainly I've been talking about hyperconvergence, and VSAN is VMware's answer to that hyperconverged story. That's what they wanted to create when they started talking about hyperconvergence. And when when VMware said, okay, we need to get into this hyperconvergence market, how do we do it? They didn't really feel like they needed to reinvent the wheel in regards to management, so they baked it right into the vSphere platform. That way administrators and VMware administrators could utilize the same tools to maintain that storage. So it comes back to that whole idea of your vSphere administrators being your storage administrators as well. Now they can use the same tool sets to achieve that. Licensing starts at the VMware standard licensing level, which a lot of SMBs are going to look at the essentials level, and they're going to, they might have some problems having to go up to the standard level, but from a cost perspective, you're still coming out ahead because you're not having to go to a large storage vendor for the storage. You can just use commodity disks inside of your chassis, as I mentioned earlier. VSAN provides a number of fantastic features such as flash read and write caching, so you can cache those most often accessed blocks. It provides all flash capabilities if you want to go that route. The cost of flash storage is coming down considerably, and VSAN offers that ability. You can do erasure coding with VSAN, which is really nice in those situations where maybe you don't need a ton of performance, but you just need a lot of storage. The erasure coding in VSAN is fantastic for that use case. And it offers storage QoS as well once you start getting up into some of the higher licensing levels, which is really useful from like a service model perspective where you want to say that this virtual machine gets this much IOPS and this virtual machine gets this many IOPS, and it's very useful from that point of view. And as I mentioned earlier, we now have a 2-node option with 6.5, which is going to drive the cost down even more because previously you had a 3-node minimum, which you were buying 3 servers, but now you can get by with 2, which is really cost effective and very attractive from an SMB perspective. Reducing complexity. Excuse me. So VSAN does a number of different things to reduce complexity in your infrastructure. The main being there's no disaggregated storage anymore. You don't have this large centralized SAN that needs management and it needs support contracts and it needs maintenance and all that different stuff. So that's really a big time saver and it reduces the complexity. And it does that by reducing the hardware footprint. Again, I don't have to power another device. I don't have to cool another device. I don't have to, like I said, manage another device, which really helps reduce the complexity of things. And one of my particular favorite bullet points here is that it reduces the number of vendors within the environment. I've been in situations during my tenure in the IT industry where you might have 10 vendors involved in a product, or in a project, and that just creates a lot of issues. There's a lot of different hands in the pie. Some vendors aren't talking with each other, and it creates a lot of issues. So if we're going to reduce the number of vendors that are involved with an environment, we can really simplify things and make our lives easier. And then if you ever need to expand, additional node installations are very simple. One thing that I really like about the hyperconverged offerings is that when you need more storage, you just add another node, and you also get some compute with it. That's kind of a nice thing. Some people don't like that. Some people like to scale different resources at different times. But when we talk about commodity hardware and how cheap stuff is getting, it doesn't hurt to add more compute when you're adding more storage, right? So it really simplifies things. And finally, reducing cost. Like I said, we don't have to purchase these expensive SANs anymore. And when I get to bullet point 2, I can think of a couple. I think of a couple of guys I know talking to me about this. They're going to say, "Well, you say vSAN and hyperconvergence is cheaper, Andy, but I know I can go get a really cheap SAN that has low-end disk and it's not that expensive." Which That may be true, but with hyperconvergence and VSAN, you're going to get better performance, better bang for your buck, because you can take some of those cost savings and add just a few flash disks into the solution and really get a lot of performance out of that too. I mean, it's really amazing the level of performance you can get just by adding a few flash disks into the solution. You don't have to have those expensive support contracts. I know that some storage vendors, sometimes it feels like their support contracts cost as much as the hardware does, believe it or not. And again, I mentioned this several times. I'm very excited about the two-node option. You know, you don't need the, you could possibly get by without the fabric and all the associated stuff in it, by doing direct connects between the nodes. And the cost of ownership is just lower, just because there's less administration. There's less stuff to wrap your hands around as an IT organization and take care of. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Teresa, and she can walk you through the architectural benefits and kind of the technical side of VSAN. Teresa, go for it.
Sounds good. So like Andy mentioned, we're going to talk specifically about VSAN architectural benefits, the tool sets, and use cases. Before I dive into that, I did want to mention I do have a lot of experience in the traditional hyper-converged storage space as well, where I see this VSAN being a very good option is in the SMB. And like Andy has mentioned, with the two-node option, I think smaller organizations can really take advantage of doing something great for their performance without spending a ton of money. So let's talk about VSAN more specifically. One of the extremely valuable adds is it can really simplify your infrastructure. Even if you just went out and bought a bunch of hardware for a different project, VSAN is extremely valuable and can be implemented really pretty easily. Now, the hyperconvergence piece, this is where compute and infrastructure become managed as one. And VSAN will do that the same way a company that sells hardware that does hyperconverged infrastructure brings all of that compute and infrastructure together with software. And in terms of management, you are now leveraging a software-defined storage model without making an expensive spend on hardware. And we're going to talk about some use cases as well. I'll highlight this again when we do, but companies that have just renewed hardware in the last year, refreshed their hardware, not realizing that this is something they were going to need, can do hyperconvergence with this product. So I just mentioned you might not have known you'd need VSAN, but you spent all kinds of money last year refreshing your storage. You can take your existing storage, implement VSAN, and it will take performance to that next level. So extremely important. I want to just reiterate that. Again, if you've refreshed your hardware, this may be a really good option for you. So how do you know if your environment can, from an architectural perspective, be a good candidate for VSAN? Well, VMware has some tools that are really, really helpful. So one, you can do a virtual SAN assessment. So VMware realizes that it's important to do this type of review to make sure. Never assume, because we know what happens when we assume. So I would strongly recommend taking the time, if you're thinking about VSAN, to do the virtual SAN assessment. You will be reached out to by a VMware person to do it, but it's just such an important step. It's like crossing your T's and dotting your I's, making sure your environment is a good candidate. Now the second tool is the VSAN Total Cost of Ownership and Sizing Calculator. Andy spent a lot of time talking about cost reduction, but this TCO will be focused specifically toward your environment and help you realize when you will achieve those cost savings. It could be next month, it could be next year based on what you have in your environment. So this tool will provide you that level of detail that you need to know for sure. So let's talk about some use cases. So in this example, I have a mid-sized educational institution and collegiate level. So when you're talking about colleges and accessing your, having students access information, especially VDI. VDI has a huge relevance in that space. So in this case, they had just refreshed their hardware in the last year. And I've mentioned this in the last couple slides. You know, they didn't know. They didn't know that they were going to have performance issues with that spend. They didn't know that it wasn't going to quite work out as expected. So, and part of that was their application intensity. In this case, their students leverage AutoCAD, they're using Adobe, and you know they are power users. So with that application intensity, VDI wasn't performing as expected. What VSAN did for their students was gave the university's IT department the ability to leverage their existing servers and storage because they had a limited budget, but now implement VSAN and take that performance to the next level without having to go back and re-justify more spend in terms of hardware. So VDI is a strong use case, but again, you know, when we're dealing with intense applications, extreme value add.
You know, Teresa, just thinking about VDI, that seems to be one of the most common use cases that I've ever come across for VSAN. Not saying that it can't be used for regular server stuff, but VDI seems to be one of the most popular, definitely. I imagine when you're talking about a VDI solution like that, Flash often comes into the conversation quite a bit, I would imagine.
Absolutely. Even when you're talking about hyperconverged infrastructure from the physical perspective through some of the vendors that sell that, Flash is really a big deal. And some people think it's really expensive or it might provide too much, like they don't need Flash because of their applications. But what I'm finding is that the cost of Flash is coming down enough that it makes sense to strongly consider it and look at it. Whether you need it today or not from a performance perspective, you will. I think historically we have seen the needs of our users and the applications we run constantly are consuming more and more I/O and IOPS. So Flash should not be off the table when you are researching storage. If it's too much today, not from a price perspective, from a performance perspective, you're going to grow into it. Flash has a life expectancy of 5 to 10 years, so a spend on that is going to go a long way.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point. And you know, personally, I think what I've run into is a lot of people, they get hung up on the amount of Flash that they think they need, and they think it's going to be outside of their price range. But you know, from what I've seen, just adding a couple Flash disks makes a massive difference in performance.
Yeah. Yeah, you may not need to go all Flash, but I'm starting to talk to organizations that are, because the cost benefit and the life expectancy of Flash makes it completely justifiable.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, so this use case is SMB focused, and this particular infrastructure is not cloud-based, although we're starting to see a lot of that. This customer was primarily set up with on-site infrastructure, and again, a limited budget, which seems to be one of the issues. You mentioned, Andy, everyone's trying to do less with more. That is so true. And products like VSAN, moving to technologies like cloud, they make that more achievable because of the simplification of the interfaces and even the simplification of the actual install, which I'll actually show you up and coming. In this particular small business, they value their remote workforce. So again, this is another VDI use case. A lot of VDI happening here. In this case, the customer is not, there's not like the CAD software. They're supporting all types of applications, from Office to Adobe to content management systems and more. So it's very broad spectrum. And they're taking a look at using the hyperconverged with the VSAN because of the budgetary constraints, already leveraging VMware technologies. So this really becomes a no-brainer type decision, and in terms of moving forward, definitely going to do that at this point. So there are other very non-specific use cases you can talk about using VSAN 4. So one is your business class applications. It is more and more commonly being used for production environments. I think in the early days of VSAN, people were just using it for test beds or disaster recovery, but now it can be used for production successfully. Now that doesn't mean disaster recovery isn't a good place for this. I think we're always looking for ways to do disaster recovery in a more affordable way. I've worked in so many organizations that don't even take the step of disaster recovery because they can't figure out how to cost justify it. When you are talking about hyperconverged infrastructure, VSAN, technologies like this, disaster recovery, can be more affordable, even for a small business. And then another use case is the application development. So your test bed, your development teams, they need a place to do their intense processing that comes with application development. VSAN is a great place to do that.
The thing I would think about application development, thinking from that perspective, is from a provisioning perspective. By reducing the amount of tools needed to provision a whole workload, you could actually enable your developers to, have more access to provisioning type of tasks, because now they don't need access to a SAN to provision LUNs and that type of thing as well.
Right. That's very true. It is. It's a one-stop shop. That's a really great point.
Yeah,
that makes... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm going to switch topics just slightly. It reminds me of the comment you made earlier in the presentation about having fewer companies or vendors to work with. And when you're dealing... So take the app development out of it, and you, as the admin of the VSAN, if you have 6 or 10 different companies to deal with in terms of the software itself, it becomes this finger-pointing game when you work with support calls, and it can be really challenging unless you can get all vendors on the phone to actually come to a form of resolution. So a little off track, but I wanted to bring that up because it's that, it's almost like that one throat to choke model where it's easier if you have one company to call instead of many. But
Well, that's a
so
really valid point because I mean just the task of getting all those vendors on the phone at the same time. I mean, you're looking at like half a day to do that in some
it,
cases.
and even longer. I mean, I've been in that situation where you didn't have the luxury of one vendor, and it was the finger pointing, or they wouldn't get on the call with the vendor for like the other company for like 3 days, and you're in this potentially crisis situation. So one vendor is a huge benefit.
Yep, yep, absolutely.
So, all right. So next, we're going to take a look at getting started with VSAN. What are the requirements and what the actual interface looks like, the steps that you would take to implement this. So at a minimum, you should be running ESXi 6.0 and vCenter version 6. Now, Andy had mentioned 6.5 is out. That changes a little bit of this, but it's not drastic. So if you are running ESXi 6.0 today, you can do this. Now, in terms of management, you're going to do all of your work for vSAN setup and configuration right on the vCenter server and through the vCenter server appliance. So again, it's all those tools we're familiar with and have been using. So it's very straightforward if you're a VMware customer. Now, with ESXi 6.0, you do require a minimum of 3 hosts, but Andy mentioned with 6.5 you can now do 2, which is a great benefit. You're going to need to make sure that you have disk and local storage caching configured, but I would expect, again, this would be a common setup for your VMware environment. And then also make sure your networking is set up in advance. So you're going to need a management network and a vMotion network to do that. The other thing you should double check is find the vSphere compatibility guide for vSAN and make sure that all of your hardware components that you are running your VMware environment on are on the supported list, and you will not have any issues. All right, so here's how you get started. So right in your VMware console, you'll notice at step 1 on the left, we have selected our host with the servers we're going to do this with. Toward step 2, you click on Manage. Step 3 is to click on Settings. And then step 4, under Virtual SAN, you're going to click General. And then toward the middle of the screen, you can see that in this case, the Virtual SAN is turned off. But when I do step 5 to configure, I'm now going to be starting the process of enabling vSAN. So it brings up a wizard, and in this screen, there really is not much you need to do out of box. Disk cleaning, you can leave at manual. We're not going to cover deduplication and compression, but it is something that you can take a look at as a TCO benefit for your environment at should you be doing vSAN in your organization. And then in terms of fault domains and structure clusters, we're not going to configure anything related to this, but if it's of interest to you, definitely research that. We would then click Next, and step 2 in the wizard, this is why the networking needs to be configured in advance. You have all your networking validation selections come up, and it will tell you if everything is okay. So we can see everything is green and golden. So we would just click Next. In terms of the disks that you're going to use, you can see here we do have a capacity tier and a cache. I did mention you need both. Once that, hopefully that was pre-configured in your environment. If not, you will need to do so. In this case it is, so we selected it and we click Next. And then the final step is just a verification of all of the steps that we chose, and we would click Finish. And you can see now in this environment toward the middle of the screen, you can see that Virtual SAN is now enabled. It's really that simple, which is why when you hear people talking about implementing VSAN being easy and straightforward, it really, really is.
So I think that pretty much wraps it up for what we had there. That was ridiculously simple. It's always amazing to me when you actually start stepping through the wizard how easy it really is.
I know.
Yeah,
I know, and it's great they made it easy for customers. It really makes it a compelling use case, even to just try it out. The other thing I could add to that, the simplicity, VMware does have a lab environment that customers can use out on their website, and try this out too if you don't want to put it in your production environment without having worked through it yourself. You could just do a search out on the VMware site for enabling the VSAN lab, and you can use their lab environment. Alternatively, if you have a test environment, I say go for it, and again, you'll see how simple this is.
those online labs are really slick, actually. If you guys haven't checked them out, I highly encourage you to go take a look. I mean, they're great for learning new features that, like Teresa said, you may be scared to implement in your own environment, just even from a testing perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So what I'll do now is just real quick talk about Altera VM Backup. Again, I mentioned earlier this was our flagship product. It's a virtual backup trusted by 30,000 SMBs. We really focus on 3 key points with our product. It's got to be easy to use and deploy. It's got to be highly capable and provide all the things that people expect to be inside of a backup application. And we provide outstanding support. I'm very, very proud of our support team. We provide fantastic support. Last I checked, we have about a 50-second response time to calls. And when you call, you get a product expert. You don't have to go through the whole "have you tried turning it off and turning it back on again" type of tiered support process. So you get somebody that's going to own your issue from A to B. So we really pride ourselves on outstanding support. Again, if you're interested in a little bit more information, you can go to altera.com/vmbackup. You can just go straight to the download at altera.com/download, and you can actually try a fully featured 30-day trial. Additionally, we have a partner program. So if you're an IT reseller or an MSP, we've got a partner program that you can sign up for. It's free to sign up. We have free partner training and certification. There's no commitment, and we have some nice discounts associated with this. For more information on that, go to altera.com/partners, or just send an email to sales@altero.com. So at this point, we'll come to the Q&A section of the webinar. If you have any questions, burning questions that you didn't feel were answered with the material we covered, there is a questions form inside of the GoToMeeting interface that you can feel free to use to submit questions. So, one question that always comes to mind when I start talking about VSAN is, how do I learn more? And like you mentioned, Teresa, using the online lab is a good place to go. But if somebody just wants like a a general overview of what VSAN is and what all the prerequisite configurations that need to be done are, what would you suggest is a good location to get that information?
Yeah, so in terms of information, well, I'm going to go back to what I mentioned. If you're interested in VSAN, make sure you do that virtual SAN assessment with VMware. That's number one. But number two, in addition to the labs, I really feel that there's some great community content out there that you can leverage. So, for example, I'm going to mention like Duncan Epping. He has a really great website that has a lot of really great information out there. But it's not just Duncan. There are so many community blogs that you can find just by going out to the web and searching. So definitely do your own research, get your hands in it, leverage VMware, and if you have a test environment, you can leverage that as well.
Yeah, sounds good. Definitely. I find myself on Duncan Epping's blog like at least once a week, it seems, these days. That guy has a fantastic blog, absolutely. Another good one that I've run across is I think it's punchingclouds.net,
Yep.
punchingclouds.com. I
Yeah,
don't remember. Yeah,
Rivera's blog. He's got some great stuff.
Yep. Both great resources for that type of information. And we've even got some VMware content out on our blog as well, altera.com/VMware, for those that are interested as well. So, got a couple other questions here. So, let's see. Looking through the list here. One thing that I often come across when it comes to VSAN requirements, I find a lot of people that are still using standard vSwitches in their environments. Is there any requirement wrapped around needing to have distributed vSwitches in order to use VSAN?
Well, so like distributed switching, typically that's related to clustering.
Yep.
You typically would not need to have that enabled.
Okay, gotcha. That's just a common one that I always get asked, and I felt that would be an interesting one to touch on.
Okay.
So at this point, I think what we'll do is we can wrap things up. We're just about out of time, actually. If there were any questions asked that were not really covered in the webinar, we're going to be doing a follow-up post after the fact out on altera.com/VMware. So you can go out there probably in the next week or so, 2 weeks tops, to take a look and see the answer to any of the questions that you asked that were not answered. Additionally, we'll have the webinar recording out there, and you can view it again and try and catch any information you didn't get the first time. So with that said, I'd like to say thanks, Teresa. Thanks for taking the time today to come out and talk to us about VSAN. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It was my pleasure.
Appreciate it. Thank you. So, and again, thanks to everyone for attending, and hope you have a great rest of the day. Thank you much.
Thank you.